Okay, welcome. The conditions in this room are a bit difficult, and my voice is very low and squeaky. So, well, I hope you can hear me. If you cannot, I'll try to be short. My name is Miriam Tveit. I'm an associate professor at Nord University here in Bodø in medieval history. And I usually work with legal history, medieval legal history. And in the early Middle Ages, as Arnstein already said, this region and this area here, Gjønes, was a chieftain site, probably. At least the site of a very important big man who had a big farm and a lot of tenants, slaves probably, and had this area here on Gjønes. There was a similar site on the other side of the fjord at Mjønes, so not Gjønes but Mjønes. Similarly, but not quite as big. So the question is, as Arnstein already said, we have this king saga who talk about this man called Raud, the Strong. He was a chieftain, big man in this fjord. Did he live here at Gjønes? That's quite possible. And if we, for the sake of this festival, says that he lived here and not out in Saltstraumen, then at around the late 10th century, in the end of the 900s, the Norwegian sort of what are they called? Those who wanted to be kings. There were continued men who had the power to take control in a larger part of Norway than only the region that they were chieftain of. And one of these were Olav Tryggvason, and he was one of the two Christianization kings who wanted to Christianize the Norwegians, who were heathens. And he attempted Christianization by the sword. He was very violent, and he had a sailing up the coast where he gave the people the choice, Christianity or death. Quite easy choice, I should say. But when he came to Salten, he met two people. It was Tore Hjort, Tore the deer, who did not want to be Christianized, so he said no, and they had a fight, and he died. And then there was Raud, who sailed in and back home in the Salten Fjord, and didn't hide there, but he did not want to be Christianized. So Olav Tryggvason, with the help of a bishop, made the Salten stream, the whirlpool, calm down so he could row into the Raud's farm, maybe here at Gjønes, and burn the whole thing down and kill everyone, and force a little worm down the throat of Raud. So it ate itself out of his belly, and he died. So that was the Vikings. And that's all I'm going to say about the Vikings, Arnstein. From then on, the kings ruled. But the concept of the assembly, the thing, was a very important part of the Nordic medieval culture and the Germanic culture in Northern Europe. Also much before what we call the Middle Ages. Already from maybe around 100, 200 after Christ, there are traditions of these assemblies in Northern Europe. They were a meeting place, but also a legal, judicial place, where people met to solve their conflicts, their disputes, but also it was a social place where they made agreements with each other, married to each other's families, did transactions, maybe bought and sold cattle. But most of all, this was a judicial place. And we don't know much about the assembly in Norway, at least, or in the Nordic region before the 900s, when we start to get some sources, some written sources. But before that, it was probably as much of a mixture of this legal as social and maybe also religious meeting place that took place at specific points in the year. After that, okay, thank you. You're just counting. Okay, I'll stand here. Do you see the screen then? No. Maybe I'll just stand over here. And here you see a little part of the colonna of the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, which is depicting a Germanic thing, assembly. So here you can see the men have gathered and they are discussing something. In the Norwegian and the Nordic assemblies, they from the 900s, they brought cases to be heard by a jury of their own peers at the assembly. So there was a spot for conflict management. So this was, for instance, disputes over what they produced, over boundaries between their areas, over marriage, but also serious accusations of homicide, violence and theft would be brought and judged by peers. So here in the north, all these assemblies were usually sited along the coast, naturally, because you went by boat, and everyone would meet at this quite neutral spot by boat. So at least from around 1000 until the 1300, the Nordic countries had assemblies for a larger region, not for the whole kingdom, but for a larger region, called a lagthing. And you can see the Norwegian lagthings here. This map is a bit northern Norwegian, maybe because this area, the northern Norway, was part of this Frosta area, at least when it came to the law that was used, and also where the cases were appealed. So the main assembly was here in Frosta, but there was also a lagthing in Steigen in northern Norway. But there was not only the regional assembly, there was also a county assembly where these were divided into 3 or 4 parts. And these were again divided into fardings, they are called, 4 parts usually, but also sometimes 3. And these again were divided into local assemblies where they met in one community. For instance, in the Jønes area, they would have met at a local assembly. And it's assumed that the local assembly was here, but that the farding assembly, a little bit bigger, was in Skjerstad, close to the church site. Because usually the assemblies were places where the churches was built afterwards. At the regional assemblies, not everyone met. Only men met, and usually representatives from their local communities. So people were chosen from the lower assemblies to travel to the regional assemblies once a year, usually in June, 17th of June. And so people from this area would travel to Steigen, further north, and attend the lagthing there. You can see here where it is. Steigen had been a very important chieftainage from the early Middle Ages, and also a thing site, but kept this position through the Middle Ages and into the early modern age, and even further. So it became a sort of seat of the judicial official in northern Norway, also in the 17th century, 18th century, and beyond. when Norway became a kingdom from the 11th century, the kings would gradually take over the assemblies, especially the regional assemblies, and they would have control over the judge there, which was what we call a lagmader. It's a term that's very difficult to translate, but it means, in the beginning it meant those who knew the law, is a lawman, but it gradually became the one who represented the king and was the high judge. He was supported by a jury of these representatives, but more and more the jury was just setting the fine or the punishment, but the lagman, the high judge, would determine each case. And ideally, these representatives would be chosen regardless of status in their local society. And therefore, the Scandinavian assemblies has been viewed as very egalitarian and also proto-democratic. But this is romantic ideas formed by the 19th century. The few sources we have suggest that the representatives were land-owning men and not their tenants. And likewise, those who took part in the juries, they were also powerful people and not your everyday man. So even though the form is very inclusive, this is an asymmetric power structure. But everyone had the right to come and be heard at the assembly and to bring their case to the assembly. So this was also normal in Sweden and Iceland, not in Denmark. They also had assemblies, but not in the same form as in Sweden and Norway and Iceland. And it became, in the late Middle Ages, a very top-down controlled system. So there's a lot to talk about the men, but what about other people? Were they allowed to the assemblies? So women were not very influential in the legal system in Norway, and not in the rest of the Nordic countries either. At least in the representative ones, like these large regional assemblies. But at the local assemblies, they had the right to meet, and if they were widows or orphan girls that had inherited their father or mother, or if there were just women who was not married or had a brother or a father or a husband or someone who could be their guardian, they would rule themselves and also therefore had the right to meet at the local assembly. And in the cases that needed the agreement of 2/3 of the assembly, they would be part of voting these in these cases. So at the local level, they had some say in the local politics and the local community. They could also be witnesses in cases, and from at least the 1200, they could take their own case to the assembly. They could also represent others if someone wanted them to, and they could be the representative of a younger brother that was a minor and not his own man yet. This is quite special for Norway. In Iceland, women had no power at the local assembly, and neither in Sweden. Sweden was the least woman-friendly legal system in the Nordic region, I'm afraid. And also as witnesses, they were usually only allowed to be witnesses in cases that were in the female sphere, for instance, childbirth, consummation of marriage, and other things that had to do with sort of the in-house woman sphere. So, Gjønes was an assembly, maybe a local assembly in the Middle Ages, but it was an assembly in the early modern period. Because as the county and regional assemblies became more institutionalized, and professionalized in the late Middle Ages, the local assemblies became increasingly important for the communities spread out all over the country. And the local assemblies now became known as bygdetinget, translated to district assembly. And at some point in the late Middle Ages, Gjønes became such a district assembly. From at least 1600, sources attest to cases being heard here. And this is also a historical period from which we have quite a lot of sources. So there are a few sources from Gjønes that I will come back to in a minute. And these early modern district courts, they had many of the same functions as the medieval local assembly. They were places of legal hearing, but also meeting places for settling issues among neighbors, petty conflicts and so on. And Alan Hutchinson, who is a historian who has studied the district assemblies in northern Norway, he said that these were arenas where the local people had a lot of knowledge of how to use the local assemblies to get their own rights. And what they wanted to get was social status. They want to protect their honor. So a lot of cases was that my neighbor is saying that I am a cheat, I am not, and I will take him to court. So the officials, they were very frustrated by all these local people who came to court with all their fights. So there was a sort of overuse of this forum. For instance, here from Gjønes, we have in 1731, Hans Jonsson brought a case to the assembly concerning his neighbor who had insulted him and talking in the village about he having a parcel of land with some special grain. And he had all this neighbor come to look at this parcel with the special grain, whatever that means. We don't know. And this dispute, like many others, were just settled with either agreement or was just dismissed by the court. But more dramatic cases would also come to the district court first. And in 1752, a woman named Berit and her stepfather, Christopher, was sentenced to death by sword, decapitation for incest and impediment. And this is a quite horrible case. Christopher had raped his stepdaughter while they were rowing back from Naustad, further out the fjord. And Berit had become pregnant as a result. And when Christopher found out, he tried to kill himself. And then the whole thing was known in the community. He was not successful, and they were both sentenced to death. The reason that the woman, Berit, was sentenced to death was that she had not come forth until her stepfather tried to kill himself. So death penalties were automatically appealed to the king, the Danish king. And he could overrun such sentences. And these two, they were imprisoned for 5 years before the king, while they were waiting the king's verdict. And he overturned the death sentence, but Christopher would do a life sentence of hard labor in Trondheim at the royal fort. But Berit was ordered to move to another parish, so she could not come back to Gjønes. But Christopher's wife and Berit's mother, she was maybe the one who lost most in this case. She lost her husband, her daughter, her honor, but in addition, her husband's part of their joint property went to the king, was confiscated by the king. So she had to sell her own part, and we don't know what happened to her. But what about the child, then, you might wonder? Terje Gudbrandsen, who has done the local history for this area, he has done a very thorough job, and he had found that the boy, Jacob his name was, he was, despite his very sad start in life, probably raised in Gjønes, so he stayed on here. He went, when he was old enough, he went into the fisheries, And when he became old in 1789, he was one of those who paid most in taxes in the village. So he must have been quite thrifty. And when he was 32, he married a local widow, and they got a daughter, which he called Berit after his mother. So that's quite sweet. And he also got a grandchild later who was also called Berit. But there were another couple who was not that lucky. There's a very famous story from this area. Milla Eriksdotter and Rasmus Jansson from Brekke, further in the Misvær Fjord. In 1681, so 100 years earlier than Berit and Christopher, Milla and Rasmus were decapitated on this island that you can see right outside here. They were decapitated for 3 times adultery and homicide. So Rasmus was married, and they were accused of having killed several of their children that came from the ongoing affair. So as a warning to others, their heads were put on a stake out in the island here. And this island was for quite a long time the execution site for the whole Nordland region. So it must have been a scary place. And the heads of these 2 people were not taken down for a while, also the myth goes. And Milla's long hair was flowing in the wind and scaring all the people who were sailing by the island. And there's a lot of myths and scary stories still being connected to it. So the assembly lost its formal role in the 18th century, but the informal role carried on nevertheless. And this meeting annually and planning and doing business and contracts and discussing the agricultural cycle, this was carried on in the local level, and it's been attested that as late as in the 1970s, small farmsteads had a sort of yard assembly, so even more local assemblies, where they met to do their arrangement and settle their issues. And the name for the assembly, Tinget, was continued in our parliament, Stortinget, and also in our legal system, in Lagtinget. So thank you for your attention. It must have been difficult to hear.